The year is 1520. The Ottoman Empire, a sprawling dominion stretching from the Danube to the Nile, holds its breath. Its ruler, Sultan Suleiman I, known to his people as Selim the Grim, lies dying. He was a ruler of ferocious energy and brutal efficiency, a man who had doubled the empire's size in just 8 years. He had crushed the Safavid Empire of Persia at the Battle of Chaldiran, conquered the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and declared himself the Caliph of Islam, the protector of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He was a warrior sultan, forged in fire and conquest, and his legacy was one of fear and unyielding strength. As he lay dying, the question on every courtier's and every statesman's mind was the same. What of his son? His son was a young man of 26 named Suleiman, and he was nothing like his father. Where Selim had been volatile and ruthless, Suleiman was poised, quiet, and thoughtful. He had spent his youth not on the battlefield, but as a governor in the provinces, particularly in Manisa, the traditional training ground for Ottoman crown princes. There he had studied history, poetry, and law. He was a skilled goldsmith, a lover of art, and a man of deep piety. He was tall and slender, with a pale complexion and an aquiline nose that gave him a noble, almost scholarly appearance. Many in the court whispered that he was too gentle, too refined, to rule the vast and turbulent empire his father had built. They feared that the son of the lion would prove to be a lamb. They could not have been more wrong. When the news of death reached Manisa, Suleiman made his way to the imperial capital, Constantinople. He entered the city not with the swagger of a conqueror, but with the quiet dignity of a rightful heir. His first acts as sultan were a clear signal of the kind of ruler he intended to be. He released hundreds of merchants and artisans whom his father had imprisoned. He returned confiscated property and paid compensation to those who had been wronged. He punished the officials who had abused their power under his father's iron-fisted rule. These were not the actions of a weakling. They were the actions of a man supremely confident in his own authority, a man who believed that justice, not fear, was the true bedrock of power. He was signaling to the world that he would be a different kind of sultan. He would be known not as the Grim, but as Kanuni, the Lawgiver. But he also knew that for an Ottoman sultan, power had to be proven on the battlefield. Tradition demanded that a new sultan lead his army to a great victory to cement his rule and fill the state's coffers with plunder. The elite Janissary corps, the heart of the Ottoman army, were restless. They had grown accustomed to the constant campaigning and rich rewards of Selim's reign. They needed to be led, to be unleashed upon a foe. Suleiman knew he had to prove that the poet and the lawmaker was also a warrior. He cast his eyes toward Europe. The West, which had watched his father's conquests in the East with a sense of relief, now looked upon the new, young sultan with uncertainty. They saw a quiet intellectual and hoped for a period of peace. The great powers of Christendom were locked in their own epic struggle. The young King Francis I of France and the even younger Holy Roman Emperor Charles V were bitter rivals, vying for control of Italy and the leadership of Europe. The Pope in Rome was trying to hold Christendom together, while a German monk named Martin Luther was tearing it apart with his radical new theology. Europe was divided, distracted, and vulnerable. Suleiman saw his opportunity. He would not just maintain the empire his father had given him, he would expand it. He would complete the work his great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror, had begun. He would push the boundaries of Ottoman power deep into the heart of Europe. His first target would be the formidable fortress of Belgrade, Belgrade stood at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, the gateway to Hungary and the key to Central Europe. It was considered the strongest fortress in the Balkans, having repelled even Mehmed the Conqueror himself. To take Belgrade would be a monumental statement. In the spring of 1521, Suleiman gathered a massive army. He marched from Constantinople at the head of his troops, the Janissaries now roaring his name with approval. The quiet scholar had put on the armor of a conqueror. The age of Suleiman the Magnificent had begun. The campaign against Belgrade was a masterpiece of Ottoman military logistics and engineering. Suleiman's army, numbering over 100,000 men, was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious force united under the banner of the Sultan. It was a war machine. Engineers built roads and bridges ahead of the main force. A massive fleet of ships sailed up the Danube, carrying heavy siege cannons, supplies, and thousands of soldiers. When the Ottoman army arrived before the walls of Belgrade in the summer of 1521, the Christian defenders were stunned by its size and organization. For weeks, the massive Ottoman siege cannons, some of the most powerful in the world, pounded the city's formidable walls. Ottoman miners dug tunnels beneath the fortifications, planting explosives to bring the ramparts crashing down. The fighting was relentless and brutal. The outnumbered defenders fought with desperate courage, but they could not hold out against the overwhelming Ottoman force. On August 29, 1521, the city of Belgrade surrendered. Suleiman rode into the conquered city in triumph. He converted the main church into a mosque, but allowed the remaining Christian population to leave with their possessions. He had achieved in a few short months what his legendary great-grandfather had failed to do. The gateway to Hungary was open. The news of Belgrade's fall sent a shockwave of fear through the courts of Europe. The quiet lamb had shown his teeth, and they were the teeth of a lion. His next target was just as symbolic, the island of Rhodes. Rhodes was the fortress stronghold of the Knights of St. John, a medieval order of crusading warrior monks. For centuries, they had been a thorn in the side of Ottoman power, launching raids on Muslim shipping and disrupting the sea lanes between Constantinople and the newly conquered province of Egypt. They were a vestige of the Crusades. A Christian dagger pointed at the heart of the Ottoman Mediterranean. For Suleiman, their presence was an intolerable affront. In the summer of 1522, he launched another massive expedition. A fleet of 400 ships carried another 100,000-man army to the island. The siege of Rhodes was even more difficult than that of Belgrade. The knights were master engineers, and their fortress was a marvel of medieval defensive architecture, a complex system of walls, moats, and bastions. They were led by their stoic Grand Master, Felipe Villiers de L'Isle Adam, for 6 months. The siege raged. The Ottoman cannons battered the walls, and Ottoman soldiers launched wave after wave of costly assaults. The knights and their small garrison fought with incredible tenacity, repulsing every attack, but Suleiman was relentless. His miners dug dozens of tunnels, and his artillery slowly, methodically pulverized the city's defenses. The casualties on both sides were immense. By December, the city was in ruins, and the defenders were exhausted and out of supplies. The Grand Master, seeing that further resistance was hopeless, asked for terms of surrender. Suleiman, admiring the courage of his defeated foes, offered generous terms. The knights were allowed to leave the island with their arms, their relics, and their honor. The remaining inhabitants of the island were guaranteed their lives, their property, and their freedom of worship. On New Year's Day, 1523, Suleiman entered the battered city. He had removed the Christian dagger from the Mediterranean, the conquests of Belgrade and Rhodes. In his first 2 years as Sultan established Suleiman's reputation as a brilliant military commander. He had secured the land and sea routes of his empire and proven himself a worthy successor to his warrior ancestors. He returned to Constantinople a hero. The courts of Europe, now fully awake to the threat he posed, began to see him not just as the Sultan of the Turks, but as the Grand Turk, the great rival to their own emperor. Charles V. The stage was set for a clash of titans, a decades-long struggle between 2 empires and 2 men who saw themselves as the rightful leaders of the world. While Suleiman was expanding the borders of his empire, a quiet revolution was beginning within the walls of his own palace. The Topkapi Palace was not just the Sultan's residence. It was the administrative heart of the empire, a city within a city, and its most secret and influential section was the imperial harem. The harem was the private domain of the Sultan and his family. It was populated by hundreds of women, many of them captured in war or sent as gifts from foreign lands, who were trained to serve the Sultan and his mother, the valid Sultan. It was a world of incredible luxury, but also of rigid hierarchy and intense competition. From among these women, the Sultan would choose his favorites, the mothers of his potential heirs. According to Ottoman tradition, a Sultan would favor one concubine, and once she bore him a son, he would have no more intimate relations with her. This one mother, one son policy was designed to prevent any single woman from gaining too much influence and to manage the inevitable and often bloody succession struggles between half-brothers. For the first few years of his reign, Suleiman followed tradition. His primary consort was a beautiful woman named Mahidevran, who had borne him a handsome and promising son, Mustafa. Mustafa was the heir apparent, and Mahidevran, as the mother of the future sultan, held a position of great prestige. But all of this was about to change because of a single, extraordinary slave girl. Her origins are shrouded in mystery. She was likely from Ruthenia, in modern-day Ukraine, captured during a Tatar raid. Her name was Alexandra Lisovska. When she entered the harem, the Ottoman court gave her a new name, Harem, which means the cheerful one, a testament to her joyful and laughing nature. To the west, she would become known by the legendary name Roxelana. Roxelana was not considered a classic beauty by Ottoman standards, but she was intelligent, charming, and possessed an iron will. She quickly caught the Sultan's eye, and more importantly, she captured his heart. Suleiman, the master of the world, became utterly captivated by this slave girl. He broke with centuries of tradition for her. He continued his relationship with her even after she bore him her first son, Mehmed. He wrote her passionate love poems, calling her his one and only love. He was utterly devoted to her. This devotion created a bitter rivalry within the harem. Harem Esrais was a direct threat to Mahidevran and her son, Mustafa. The two women clashed, and in one infamous incident, Mahidevran physically assaulted Harem, scratching her face and tearing her hair. When Suleiman summoned Harem, she refused to go, saying she was not fit to be seen by the Sultan in her battered state. This only intrigued Suleiman more. When he learned what had happened, his favor shifted decisively. Mahidevran was sidelined, and Harem's influence grew. In an act that stunned the entire empire, Suleiman did the unthinkable. In 1533, he formally married Harem Sultan, making her his legal wife. He had elevated a foreign-born slave to the status of empress. This was a radical break with tradition, a testament to the immense power Harem now held over him. She moved from the old palace, where the harem was traditionally housed, into the Topkapi Palace itself, placing her at the physical and political center of power. She would go on to bear Suleiman 5 more children, including 4 sons, creating a dynasty of her own within the royal family. But harem was not the only person who had the Sultan's ear. Suleiman's closest friend and confidant was a man named Barbarossa Ibrahim. Ibrahim was like Harem, a Christian-born slave who had risen through the ranks. He had been Suleiman's companion since their youth in Manisa. He was brilliant, ambitious, and incredibly capable. Suleiman trusted him completely. He showered Ibrahim with honors, eventually appointing him Grand Vizier, the second most powerful position in the empire. Ibrahim was more than a minister. He was Suleiman's alter ego. He was so powerful that he was often referred to as the shadow of the Sultan. He even married Suleiman's own sister, solidifying his place within the royal family. For a time, Suleiman ruled a triumvirate of power. There was himself, the absolute monarch. There was Harem, the love of his life and the mother of his children, who ruled his heart. And there was Ibrahim, his best friend and his right-hand man, who ruled the administration of his empire. But this delicate balance could not last. The Topkapi Palace was not big enough for 2 brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless former slaves. The love of the Sultan was a prize to be won, and Harem and Ibrahim were now locked in a silent, deadly struggle for influence. It was a struggle that would end in betrayal and blood, and it would change the destiny of the Ottoman Empire forever. While the drama of the palace unfolded, Suleiman continued to project his power outwards. His gaze was fixed on the heart of Europe. The rivalry with the Habsburg Emperor, Charles V, had become the defining geopolitical struggle of the age. It was a clash of 2 faiths and 2 empires, but also of 2 men who both believed they held a universal claim to power. The prize in this struggle was the Kingdom of Hungary. In 1526, Suleiman led his army back into the Hungarian plains. At the Battle of Mohacs, the Ottoman army met the forces of the young King Louis II of Hungary. The Hungarian army, filled with brave but impetuous knights, was a relic of medieval warfare. The Ottoman army was a modern killing machine, built around the disciplined firepower of the janissaries and the thunder of its artillery. The battle was a catastrophe for Hungary. In a matter of hours, the Hungarian army was annihilated. King Louis himself drowned in a river while fleeing the battlefield. The kingdom was left leaderless and defenseless. The victory at Mohacs was one of the most decisive in Ottoman history. Suleiman marched into the Hungarian capital of Buda and installed his own vassal king. But control of Hungary would remain contested for decades. Drawing Suleiman deeper and deeper into Central Europe, his ambition now knew no bounds. If he could take Hungary, why not strike at the very heart of his rival's empire? In 1529, Suleiman embarked on his most audacious campaign yet, a march on Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg domains. The siege of Vienna was the high-water mark of Ottoman expansion into Europe. Suleiman arrived before the city with another massive army, but this time the odds were not in his favor. The campaign had started late in the year, and his army had been battered by unusually bad weather and torrential rains on the long march. They had been forced to abandon much of their heavy siege artillery, which had become hopelessly bogged down in the mud. The defenders of Vienna, though heavily outnumbered, were determined. They were led by a grizzled veteran commander and had fortified the city's medieval walls as best they could. They fought with the desperation of men defending their homes. Suleiman's army, lacking its heavy cannons, was forced to rely on mining. To breach the walls, but the defenders countermined effectively. The Ottoman assaults were thrown back with heavy losses. As the weeks dragged on, the weather grew colder. The Ottoman army, far from home and short on supplies, began to suffer from disease and plummeting morale. The Janissaries, for the first time, grew restless and defiant in mid-October. With winter fast approaching, Suleiman was forced to make a difficult decision. He ordered one final, massive assault. When it failed, he knew the campaign was lost. He lifted the siege and began the long, miserable retreat back to Constantinople. The failure at Vienna was a major psychological blow. It was the first time Suleiman had been stopped. It demonstrated that there were practical limits to Ottoman power. The vast distances, the unpredictable weather, and the resilient defense of a determined enemy had proven to be insurmountable obstacles. While the Ottomans would remain a dominant force in Hungary for another century and a half, the dream of conquering the heart of Europe had died in the muddy trenches before the walls of Vienna. The city would stand as the ultimate barrier between the cross and the crescent, the rock upon which the Ottoman tide had finally broken. The magnificent Sultan had discovered the limits of his magnificence. The failure at Vienna did little to diminish Suleiman's power, but it subtly shifted the empire's focus. The era of rapid, spectacular conquest was waning, and the internal politics of the palace grew ever more important. The silent war between Hurrem Sultan and the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha was reaching its climax. Ibrahim Pasha had reached a pinnacle of power unprecedented for a Grand Vizier. He was a brilliant diplomat and military strategist. He commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and effectively ran the day-to-day affairs of the empire. He was fabulously wealthy, and his palace in Constantinople rivaled the Sultan's own in splendor. But his ambition and his pride had begun to outstrip his judgment. He grew arrogant, seeing himself not as the Sultan's servant, but as his equal. He began to use titles, such as Saraska, Sultan, which implied a share in the sovereign power. This was a dangerous overreach. Hurrem Sultan, meanwhile, had been patiently consolidating her own power. She was not just the Sultan's wife, she was his most trusted political advisor. Suleiman valued her intelligence and her shrewd political instincts. She corresponded with him while he was on campaign, keeping him informed of the events in the capital. She sponsored massive public works, mosques, and charities, endearing herself to the people. And she never missed an opportunity to whisper in the Sultan's ear, to subtly undermine her rivals and to promote the interests of her own sons. Her primary target was Ibrahim. She saw him as the greatest obstacle to her ambition. As long as Ibrahim was in power, her sons would never be secure. The succession was not guaranteed. The most popular and widely respected heir was still Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by his first consort, Mahid. Mustafa was handsome, brave, and a skilled warrior, beloved by the army and the people. He was seen as the perfect successor, a reflection of the young Suleiman himself. But he was not Hurrem's son. If Mustafa became Sultan, tradition dictated that he would have his half-brothers Hurrem's sons executed to prevent a civil war. For Hurrem, the survival of her children depended on Mustafa never reaching the throne. Ibrahim Pasha was a staunch supporter of Prince Mustafa. He saw in Mustafa the future of the dynasty and worked to promote his career. This placed him in direct opposition to Hurrem. The rivalry between the Empress and the Grand Vizier became a battle for the future of the empire. Hurrem began to carefully plant seeds of doubt in Suleiman's mind about his old friend. She highlighted Ibrahim's arrogance, his vast wealth, and his growing presumption of power. She may have fabricated evidence or twisted his words to make him appear disloyal. Suleiman, a man who demanded absolute loyalty and who was prone to fits of melancholy and suspicion, began to watch his Grand Vizier with a newly critical eye. The final straw came during a campaign against the Safavid Empire in Persia. Ibrahim, in command of the army, made a series of decisions that were seen as self-aggrandizing and disrespectful to the Sultan's authority. The whispers from harem, combined with Ibrahim's own hubris, sealed his fate. In March of 1536, after returning to Constantinople, Ibrahim Pasha was invited to have dinner with the Sultan at the Topkapi Palace, a common occurrence. He entered the palace that evening as the second most powerful man in the world. He would not leave it alive. What happened during that final dinner is unknown, but sometime during the night, on the Sultan's orders, a team of royal executioners, who were traditionally deaf-mutes to prevent them from hearing or revealing state secrets, strangled Ibrahim Pasha in his sleep. His vast property was confiscated by the state. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Suleiman had executed the man who had been his brother, his closest friend, and his most brilliant servant for over a decade. The act was a stunning demonstration of the Sultan's absolute power, but it was also a sign of a growing paranoia. He would later express deep regret for the decision. With Ibrahim gone, Harem Sultan's influence became supreme. There was now no one standing between her and the levers of power, and no one to protect the one person who stood in the way of her sons, Prince Mustafa. The execution of Ibrahim Pasha marked a dark turning point in Suleiman's reign. The triumvirate of power was broken. Harem Sultan was now the undisputed political partner of the Sultan. With her primary rival eliminated, she focused all her considerable intelligence and cunning on securing the throne for one of her own sons. Maneuvering against the popular heir, Prince Mustafa, Mustafa was everything the empire desired in a future sultan. As governor of Manisa, he had proven himself to be a just and capable administrator. He was a talented poet and a patron of the arts, but he was also a superb military commander, adored by the Janissaries, who saw in him the martial spirit of their greatest rulers. His popularity was his greatest asset, but in the treacherous world of Ottoman succession, it was also his greatest liability. To a suspicious father and a scheming stepmother, his popularity could easily be portrayed as a threat harem. Along with her son-in-law, the new Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha began a systematic campaign to poison Suleiman's mind against his eldest son. They crafted a narrative of treason. They intercepted letters, perhaps forging them, to suggest that Mustafa was in secret communication with the Safavid Shah of Persia, the empire's great enemy. They spread rumors that the Janissaries were planning to depose the aging sultan and place the young, popular Mustafa on the throne. Suleiman, now in his late 50s, was increasingly isolated. He was plagued by gout and the burdens of his long reign. The loss of his friend Ibrahim had made him more suspicious, more prone to seeing shadows in every corner. He remembered how his own father, Selim the Grim, had ruthlessly eliminated his brothers and forced his own father to abdicate to secure the throne. The fear of a rebellion led by a populous son was deeply ingrained in the Ottoman psyche. Harem's whispers played upon his deepest insecurities. In 1553, Suleiman was leading another campaign against Persia. He summoned Prince Mustafa to join him at his camp in the Aragli Valley. Mustafa's advisors begged him not to go. They warned him that it was a trap, but Mustafa, a man of great honor, refused to believe that his father could harm him. To refuse the Sultan's summons would be an open act of rebellion. He chose to obey. He rode into the royal camp and was greeted with cheers from the Janissaries. This display of his son's popularity only served to confirm Suleiman's fears. Mustafa proceeded to his father's royal tent. As he entered, he was disarmed. As was custom, inside he found not his father, but a team of 7 deaf-mute executioners. A terrible struggle ensued. Mustafa, a man of great strength, fought desperately for his life, but he was outnumbered. The executioners overpowered him and, using a bowstring, they strangled him to death. Legend says that Suleiman watched the entire ordeal from behind a screen. The news of Mustafa's execution sent a shockwave of grief and rage through the army and the empire. The Janissaries were on the verge of open revolt. They blamed Hurrem and Rustam Pasha for the death of their beloved prince. To quell their anger, Suleiman was forced to dismiss his Grand Vizier, but the damage was done. In the eyes of many, Suleiman had executed the future of the dynasty. With Mustafa gone, the succession was now a contest between Hurrem's 2 remaining sons, the bookish and frail Bayezid, and the indolent and pleasure-loving Selim. The rivalry between the 2 brothers, fanned by the flames of court politics, eventually erupted into open civil war. Selim, with the support of his father, defeated his brother's forces. Bayezid fled to the court of the Safavid Shah, but he was eventually handed over to his father's agents and executed, along with his own young sons. The path was now clear. The heir to the magnificent Suleiman would be his son Selim, who would come to be known as Selim the Sot, or Selim the Blonde, a man who preferred the pleasures of the harem to the duties of the state. Hurrem Sultan had won. She had secured the throne for her son, but she did not live to see him rule. Dying in 1558, the price of her victory had been the stability of the dynasty itself. Suleiman, the Lawgiver, had presided over the murder of 2 of his most capable sons, leaving the empire to a far lesser man. The golden age was beginning to tarnish. The final years of Suleiman's reign were cloaked in shadow and sorrow. He was an old man now, well into his 70s, a great age for the era. He was racked by gout, his body stooped, and his face etched with the grief of his personal tragedies. The magnificent court that had once glittered with artists and poets was now a place of whispered conspiracies and mournful silence. He was haunted by the ghosts of the men he had ordered killed, his best friend, Ibrahim, and his most beloved son, Mustafa. The empire, too, was showing signs of where the constant warfare had strained the treasury. Corruption was beginning to creep into the administration. The Janissaries, once the disciplined heart of the army, were growing more powerful and demanding a state within the state. The machinery of the empire was still immense and powerful, but the brilliant spirit that had driven it was fading. Suleiman, aware of his own mortality and perhaps seeking to outrun his ghosts, decided to lead his army one last time. It was a chance to prove to the world and to himself that the great warrior was not yet dead. In 1566, at the age of 71, he mounted his horse and led his 13th and final campaign. The target was the fortress of Szigетva in Hungary, a minor stronghold that had been defying Ottoman authority. The march was an ordeal for the old Sultan. He was so ill that he was often carried in a litter, but he was determined to see the campaign through. The siege of Szigetva began. In August, the fortress was defended by a small but incredibly brave force led by the Croatian nobleman Nikola Zubizarinsky. For over a month, the defenders held out against the massive Ottoman army. inflicting heavy casualties. The final battle was an act of suicidal heroism. Zrinski, knowing the end was near, dressed in his finest silks, filled his pockets with gold so that the man who looted his body would be well rewarded, and led his few remaining soldiers in a final, desperate charge out of the castle gates. They were all cut down. The fortress had fallen. It was another Ottoman victory. But the Sultan would not live to see it. Just one day before the final assault, on the night of September 7th, 1566, Suleiman the Magnificent, the Lawgiver, the 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, died peacefully in his royal tent. His Grand Vizier, Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic, made a fateful decision. He knew that the news of the Sultan's death could cause panic and chaos in the army, especially before the final victory was secured. He decided to keep the death a secret. He had the Sultan's personal physician strangled to ensure his silence. For nearly 3 weeks, the Grand Vizier ruled the empire from the dead Sultan's tent, issuing orders in his name. The body of the great Sultan was secretly embalmed, and his heart and organs were buried beneath his tent. The charade was maintained during the long march back to Constantinople. Only when they were near the capital was the army finally told that the master they had been following for months was long dead. Suleiman was buried in a magnificent tomb next to his beloved wife. Harem at the Suleimani Mosque, the architectural masterpiece that had been built for him by his great architect. Mimar Sinan, his legacy was immense. He had ruled for 46 years, longer than any other sultan. He had presided over the empire's greatest territorial expansion and its most spectacular cultural achievements. He had reformed the laws, built magnificent mosques, and patronized the arts. He was, without question, the greatest of all the Ottoman rulers, but his reign also contained the seeds of the empire's long, slow decline. His elevation of harem had upset the delicate balance of the court and given the women of the harem a political influence that would often prove disastrous in the centuries to come. And his decision to execute his most capable son, Mustafa, had broken the tradition of meritocratic succession, paving the way for a series of weaker, less capable sultans. He left the empire to his son, Selim II, a man who would rather drink wine than lead armies. The Sultanate of women had begun, and the era of the warrior sultans was over. The magnificent shadow had passed, and the world he had built would never be quite the same.